So there's 4 stages of diastole. The first stage is called the isovolumic relaxation time, or the IVRT. This is going to start right after your T wave on your EKG, which is the end of systole. Or you could say it starts at the end of the ejection time. The ejection time is during systole right here. You see this right here? What happens is your semilunar valves will close, and this starts IVRT. You'll be asked, or you could be asked questions, what starts IVRT? When your semilunar valves close, then you have this IVRT period where nothing happens, right? The normal IVRT is anywhere from 70 milliseconds to 85, 90 milliseconds. What ends IVRT is when your atrioventricular valves open. Right after IVRT, that's the first stage. Then we're going to have early filling. The second stage of diastole is the early filling. This is also called early filling or rapid filling, or early diastole. If you look at my images here, these spectral Doppler waveforms will correlate with your early filling or rapid filling. This is your E wave, and this is your E prime. This early rapid filling, this E wave, represents the second stage of diastole. This occurs at the same time as your E prime. You'll have to know that that counts for about 85% of ventricular filling. The third stage of diastole is your diastasis. This is mid-diastole where nothing should occur. This is the time period between your E wave and your A wave, or rapid filling and late filling, or early filling and late filling. So your ventricles are going to fill the second your AV valves open until you reach diastasis. Once diastasis starts, nothing should happen briefly. But then you start your fourth and final stage of diastole, which is your atrial contraction that occurs during late diastole. There are times where you will see something during diastasis. If you look at the spectral Doppler waveform, you have your E and A wave, but right in between, there's an L wave. This is where diastasis would occur, or is occurring. This is pathological. This means you either have grade 2 or grade 3 diastolic dysfunction. And this is caused by high pressures in the left atrium. The left atrium has pressures that are so high that during diastasis, you'll see a little bit of blood flow going to the ventricles in between your E and A. The fourth and final stage is your atrial contraction, late diastole. This is where you're going to get the last little bit of your diastolic filling, which counts for 15% of ventricular filling. Your atrial contraction, late diastole, correlates with your A wave if you were evaluating the mitral valve leaflets with pulse wave, and your A prime if you're using TDI. These occur at the same time. This is considered the isovolumic contraction time, the IVCT. This is the time period where nothing should happen, and it has about the same normal range, 70 to 80 milliseconds. I know I said 70 to 90 before, but it just depends on which literature you read. This is going to occur right around your QRS complex. All your valves will be closed, and when you're looking at the diagram here, this is the time period when your AV valves close. So that starts, IVCT starts when your AV valves close and ends when your semilunar valves open. What immediately follows IVCT? Be very aware of your EKG and your Wigger's diagram, and be able to answer what starts and ends IVCT, what happens just before IVCT, and what happens right after IVCT. What happens immediately preceding IVCT is your atrial kick, late filling, late diastole. This is going to help you understand where pathology will occur in relation to this Wigger's diagram. Anytime that you hear a murmur in systole, you're going to think this time period, the ejection time. So a murmur that occurs in systole, just to name a couple, are aortic stenosis, pulmonic stenosis, ventricular septal defect shunts, mitral regurgitation, and tricuspid regurgitation. Actually, I named more than a few. What immediately follows IVCT, which is this dotted line right here, that's the time period from when your AV valves close to when your semilunar valves open. What immediately follows this time period is you could see aortic stenosis, you could see pulmonic stenosis, you could see tricuspid regurgitation, and you could see mitral regurgitation. You could also see VSD shunts. What immediately precedes IVCT are murmurs that you could hear that include mitral stenosis, tricuspid stenosis, aortic regurgitation, and pulmonic regurgitation. Just think of any of the murmurs that you would hear in diastole. Right before AV valves close, your semilunar valves are closed, right? So you would see aortic regurgitation and pulmonic regurgitation during this time period. You could hear a S3 sound. It's the sound of early filling and rapid ventricular filling. It occurs right here, the S3. And then you could also hear an S4, which is a high atrial pressure. 3 and 4 are abnormal. S1 and S2 are normal. S1 is just when your mitral valve closes. S2 is when your aortic valve closes. What immediately precedes IVCT? Is it A, aortic stenosis, tricuspid regurgitation, aortic regurgitation, pulmonic stenosis? So how would you answer this question here? What we want to do first is determine what starts IVCT. And what starts IVCT is the closure of the atrioventricular valves or the mitral and tricuspid valve. That means anything that happened just before IVCT was end diastole or just diastole. Now, we just have to look at the options to see which occurs during diastole. Aortic stenosis? No, that's during systole. Tricuspid regurgitation? No, that's again during systole. Aortic regurgitation? Yes. Pulmonic stenosis? No. So the answer to this question, what precedes IVCT, would be your aortic regurgitation. Now what's your answer? To answer this question, we have to ask ourselves what ends IVRT. And it looks like when the mitral valve and tricuspid valve open, this will end IVRT. That means we're going to look for options that occur during diastole. Aortic stenosis? No, that's during systole. Tricuspid regurgitation? Nope, that's during systole. Aortic regurgitation? Yes. Pulmonic stenosis? No, because that's during systole. You might be expected to know the waveforms of TDI without being shown your image up here. So for instance, which waveform represents the IVCT, which one represents the IVRT, which one represents the E prime, or which one represents the A prime? How do you figure that out? What you want to look for is your waveform above the baseline like this, that's kind of spread apart. This represents your systole. When we look at this image here, do you see this waveform right here? See how wide that is? That's the first thing I look for to orient myself. If I find that, then I can kind of like work my way back and work my way forward. When we look at this image here, the widest waveform above the baseline is this one. This has got to be systole. This is during your ejection time. That's the same thing as this waveform right here. Now that I know that this is systole, this has got to be my IVCT. This is your IVRT. If you want to locate your E prime and A prime, first find systole. Then you know that this is going to be isovolumic contraction time right before. IVRT is the first stage of diastole. What's the second stage? Your early filling, your E prime, right? That means this has to be your E prime right there. And then right after that, you're going to have your A prime.
Wow.
So that's how you orient yourself if you don't have an EKG. Just locate something that you're familiar with. That's IVRT, and then this is your E wave, your A prime. So your mitral valve will close. This basically ends diastole. Your mitral valve closes, as well as your tricuspid valve. Both AV valves will close, and this will start your isovolumic contraction time. Then your semilunar valves will open right here after isovolumic contraction time ends. The pulmonic and the aortic valve will open after your IVCT ends. This will start your ejection time, the blue line here, because your semilunar valves are open, meaning your ventricles are contracting. Now, you see how this blue line rises slightly higher than the aortic pressure? This is normal. This should happen temporarily. During the ejection time, your ventricular pressure will be slightly higher than your aortic pressure. But then it'll start to come down because systole is ending. What ends systole is, if you look closely, your aortic valve and your pulmonic valve will close, and this will start your IVRT, your isovolumic relaxation time. So that's in between this solid line and this dotted line. This is your IVRT. Nothing should happen here. On your boards, you'll have to know what ends the ejection time, what starts the ejection time, what starts IVRT, what ends IVRT, what starts IVCT, what ends IVCT. Let's say they ask you, which of the following will start isovolumic contraction time? When your mitral and tricuspid valve close, that will start your isovolumic contraction time. Your ejection time will start when your aortic valve and your pulmonic valve open. They could ask you, what will start isovolumic relaxation time? When the aortic valve and the pulmonic valve close, that will start IVRT. What ends IVRT? When your AV valve is open, this will end IVRT. But this is how they're going to get you on the boards. They're going to say, what else happens during the ejection time? And they'll say answers like, your aortic pressure decreases, your ventricular volume decreases, your ventricular pressure decreases, your atrial pressure increases. Here's where they'll get you, because they're going to expect you not to know this part. What you're going to look for is your ventricular volume will decrease during the ejection time. That only makes sense because the volume is decreasing because it's pushing the blood out to the body. At the same time, your atrial pressure will decrease. So why do you think the atrial pressure will decrease? Because they had just barely filled the ventricles right before systole. So they filled the ventricles, meaning the atria are at their smallest. So the pressure will go down and then start to go up because the atria are starting to fill during systole. So if you look at this line here, this orange line, this is the atrial pressure. You can see how the pressure is higher than the ventricular pressure during diastole. Why do you think that is? Here's the best way to remember this. Blood will always travel from the highest pressure to the lowest pressure. During diastole, the pressure is going to be higher in the atria, which will help the blood flow move from the atria to the ventricles. Now the ventricles have that suction going on, but the pressure is still going to be higher because blood is moving towards the ventricles. The pressure in the atria will be higher than the ventricles during diastole. These are the little things they'll get you on the boards.